The morning sun filtered through the tall, imposing windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. 3-year-old Emma sat rigidly on the hard wooden bench, her tiny feet dangling several inches above the cold floor. She wore a pink dress that her grandmother had carefully selected days ago, spending extra time ironing it perfectly, hoping that looking nice might somehow make this terrifying day better. But no amount of pretty clothing could mask the emotional turmoil churning beneath Emma's pale, anxious face. Her distant eyes seemed to look through rather than at the world around her, as if she were trying to disappear into herself. The courthouse was cold and imposing, all towering marble columns, echoing footsteps, and vast empty spaces that seemed to swallow sound. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above, decorated with ornate details that would have impressed any visitor on a normal day. But for Emma, the grandeur only added to the overwhelming sense of being trapped in an enormous, threatening place. The air itself felt heavy, laden with the weight of serious legal matters and the formality of the justice system. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the distant closing of doors, the muffled conversations of attorneys, made Emma flinch slightly, her body responding to stimuli with the hypersensitivity of a deeply traumatized child. Emma's small fingers were wrapped so tightly around her stuffed rabbit that her tiny knuckles had turned a pale white from the pressure. The rabbit, worn and soft from countless nights of being held, was her only comfort in this alien world. She had named it Flopsy when she was just a baby, and it had been her constant companion through the chaos and uncertainty of her short life. The stuffed animal smelled like home, like the one place where she had ever felt even remotely safe. She brought it close to her face, breathing in that familiar scent, trying desperately to block out the sterile, unfamiliar smells of the courthouse. The polish on the wooden benches, the leather of the attorneys' briefcases, the sharp tang of industrial cleaner. Around her, lawyers in dark suits and crisp white shirts moved with purposeful efficiency, shuffling through thick folders and speaking in serious, hushed tones. The attorneys looked stern and professional, their faces grave with the weight of their responsibilities. They spoke about custody, safety, and Emma's future, words that floated over her head like clouds she couldn't quite grasp. She didn't understand the legal terminology or the complex arguments being made in her name. To Emma, the words were just noise, scary noise that seemed to confirm her worst fears, that something very wrong was happening, that her world was about to change in ways she couldn't control or predict. Her grandmother sat beside her, a woman whose weathered face and gentle brown eyes told the story of decades spent loving and caring for others. Her name was Margaret, though Emma called her Grandma, a title she said with the kind of desperate attachment that broke Margaret's heart. Margaret's hand rested on Emma's back, stroking her granddaughter's hair in the same soothing rhythm she had used since Emma was an infant. It was a gesture born of pure love and instinct, a grandmother's attempt to transmit safety and reassurance through physical touch. But even that familiar gesture, normally so comforting, couldn't penetrate the thick walls of anxiety that Emma had constructed around herself. Margaret could feel the tension in her granddaughter's small body, the way her muscles remained clenched, the shallow quality of her breathing, the occasional tremors that ran through her limbs. She knew that Emma was barely holding it together, that the child's nervous system was in a state of constant alert, ready to react to perceived threats at any moment. Margaret had learned through countless nights of caring for Emma that the little girl's trauma responses were involuntary, the result of experiences that had rewired her developing brain. She whispered gentle encouragements. "It's okay, sweetheart. Grandma's right here. You're safe." Even though she wasn't entirely certain Emma could hear her over the roaring anxiety in her own mind. The judge sat at his elevated bench, his black robes adding to the formality and authority of his position. He was an experienced jurist who had presided over countless custody cases, and he recognized immediately the signs of severe trauma in the small child before him. His weathered face reflected both compassion and the weight of the difficult decisions he had to make. Behind him hung the Great Seal, a symbol of justice and the rule of law. To Emma, it was just another scary thing in a room full of scary things, a reminder that this was an official place where important, frightening decisions were being made about her life. The courtroom itself was a study in formality and intimidation. High ceilings, ornate woodwork, the formal bench where the judge sat elevated above everyone else. Every architectural element was designed to convey authority and seriousness. There were no decorations meant to comfort or soften the space, no acknowledgement that a 3-year-old child would ever need to sit in such an environment. The hard benches were designed for adults, the proceedings conducted at a pace and complexity meant for legal professionals. Emma felt dwarfed by the space, insignificant and powerless, exactly the opposite of what a traumatized child needed to feel. As the morning progressed, Emma remained largely silent, occasionally glancing around the room with the confused and frightened expression that only a traumatized young child could wear. Sometimes her eyes would land on her grandmother's face, seeking reassurance, seeking confirmation that this nightmare would eventually end. Other times, she would stare at nothing in particular, her mind seemingly elsewhere, lost in the interior landscape of her own fear and confusion. She understood on some level that this hearing was about her mother, about where she would live. But the understanding was fragmented and incomplete, filtered through a child's limited comprehension and her current state of emotional crisis. The legal professionals present, the judge, the attorneys, the social workers, the court-appointed child advocate, all understood the gravity of what they were undertaking. They knew that their decisions would shape the trajectory of Emma's entire life. They recognized that she was a vulnerable, traumatized child who needed safety, stability, and unconditional love. They could see the fear in her eyes and understood that she was barely coping with the stress of this proceeding. Yet the formal nature of the legal system meant that the hearing had to proceed according to established protocols and procedures. Regardless of the emotional toll it was taking on the smallest person in the room. Everyone present would have preferred a gentler way to resolve this matter, but the system was what it was, and they could only work within its constraints, hoping that the outcome would ultimately serve the best interests of this deeply wounded child who sat trembling on a too-large bench in a too-large courtroom on what would prove to be one of the most important days of her life. The custody hearing that brought 3-year-old Emma to the imposing courthouse existed for one critical reason. Her young life had been marked by chaos, neglect, and circumstances that no child should ever have to endure. Emma's story was one of heartbreak and systemic failure, a tragic narrative that had unfolded over the first 3 years of her existence. Her biological mother, Jessica, was a woman who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse and raising a family in a small home with a garden. But life had taken a cruelly different turn, and those dreams had been replaced by the dark grip of addiction that consumed everything in its path. Jessica had given birth to Emma when she was just 24 years old, unmarried and unprepared for the demands of motherhood. At first, she had tried. She had genuinely wanted to be a good mother, to provide for her daughter, to break the cycle of dysfunction that had plagued her own childhood. But the pressures of single parenthood, financial instability, and her own unaddressed mental health issues had quickly overwhelmed her fragile resolve. Within months of Emma's birth, Jessica had turned to substances as a way to cope with the stress and anxiety. What began as occasional recreational use gradually spiraled into a full-blown addiction that consumed her thoughts, her time, and her resources. The drugs, primarily methamphetamine and heroin, became her primary relationship, more important than food, shelter, or even her own daughter. The home where Emma spent her early years was a study in dysfunction and danger. Jessica's apartment was located in a deteriorating part of the city, in a building where the landlord barely maintained basic habitability standards. The walls were thin, and the sounds of violence, screaming arguments, and drug deals regularly penetrated through them. The apartment itself was filthy, with dishes piling up in the kitchen sink for weeks at a time, laundry scattered across every surface, and the distinctive smell of stale cigarette smoke and worse substances permeating everything. Emma's crib sat in a corner of the bedroom, often surrounded by beer bottles and used drug paraphernalia that Jessica, in her impaired state, didn't even notice or consider dangerous. Jessica's addiction had transformed her from a person into something consumed by need. She would disappear for days at a time, leaving Emma in the care of whatever boyfriend or acquaintance happened to be around, individuals who had no emotional investment in the child's well-being and little to no ability or inclination to provide basic care. These temporary caretakers were often also substance users, people who viewed the small child in their midst as an inconvenience, something to be ignored while they pursued their own addictions and destructive behaviors. Emma would go hungry for extended periods, wearing the same soiled clothes for days. There were nights when the electricity was shut off because Jessica had spent the money meant for utilities on drugs. In the darkness, Emma would cry herself to sleep, not understanding why her mother wasn't there, not comprehending that her mother's absence was a choice born of addiction rather than necessity. The environment exposed Emma to sights and experiences that scarred her developing psyche in ways that therapists would spend years trying to help her process. She witnessed arguments that escalated to physical violence between her mother and various men who cycled through her life. She saw needles, pipes, and other paraphernalia associated with drug use scattered around the apartment. She heard screaming, crying, and the sounds of objects being thrown in anger. At 3 years old, Emma's brain was supposed to be developing in an environment of safety and predictability, learning to trust that her caregivers would meet her needs and protect her from harm. Instead, her developing neural pathways were being shaped by trauma, unpredictability, and the constant background radiation of danger. The physical neglect was severe and documented. Emma's grandmother, Margaret, had noticed during occasional visits that her granddaughter was often underfed and underweight for her age. The little girl's clothes were frequently inappropriate for the weather, too thin in winter, unsuitable in summer. Emma's hair was often unwashed and matted, her fingernails dirty and overgrown. There were unexplained bruises on her small body, marks that Emma couldn't or wouldn't explain when asked how she got them. More concerning was Emma's behavioral regression and the development of concerning psychological symptoms. She had stopped speaking as much, becoming withdrawn and fearful. She exhibited extreme anxiety around sudden movements or loud noises, flinching violently at sounds that wouldn't startle a typical child. She displayed unusual feeding behaviors, sometimes hoarding food and eating it in secret, behavior that suggested periods of genuine hunger. Margaret, Emma's grandmother, had been watching this tragedy unfold with increasing horror and desperation. She had tried repeatedly to help Jessica, offering financial assistance, encouraging her to enter treatment programs, and eventually threatening to involve Child Protective Services. But Jessica had responded with anger and defensiveness, cutting off contact with her mother for months at a time, then reaching out again when she needed money or help. Margaret felt trapped between her love for her daughter and her desperate need to protect her granddaughter. She knew that something had to give, that Emma couldn't continue living in these conditions without suffering permanent psychological damage. The decision to contact Child Protective Services had been the most difficult of Margaret's life, a betrayal of her daughter that she knew was necessary to save her granddaughter. When the child protection investigators finally arrived at Jessica's apartment, they found conditions worse than anyone had anticipated. The apartment was not just dirty but hazardous. There were drug paraphernalia and needles accessible to the child. The refrigerator contained almost no food suitable for a young child, mostly alcohol and condiments. Emma was found wearing a diaper that hadn't been changed in what appeared to be many hours, her skin severely irritated and raw. The child was dehydrated and showed signs of malnutrition. Most heartbreaking to the investigators was Emma's response to being approached. She didn't cry or reach out, but instead froze, exhibiting the learned helplessness of a child who had stopped expecting comfort or help from the adults in her life. The legal case that emerged from this investigation was straightforward in its findings, but complex in its implications. The evidence of neglect was irrefutable. Hospital records documented Emma's low weight and developmental delays. Interviews with neighbors confirmed Jessica's pattern of abandonment. Photographs of the apartment's condition were presented as evidence of the unsuitable living situation. Yet despite the clarity of the case, there remained the painful question of what would happen to Emma going forward. Could Jessica be rehabilitated? Could she eventually regain custody if she successfully completed treatment? Or had the damage to her parental rights become permanent? These questions hung over the custody hearing, providing the legal and emotional context for why a 3-year-old girl sat trembling on a courtroom bench, her entire future about to be decided by a judge, while her mother sat in another part of the courthouse, represented by a public defender, fighting to maintain some vestige of parental rights to a daughter she had so thoroughly failed. The judge, whose name was Judge Theodore Harrison, was a man with 30 years of experience presiding over custody cases. He had seen the worst that human nature had to offer, but he had also witnessed remarkable transformations and instances of profound love that transcended biological relationships. Judge Harrison understood that every custody case was unique, that cookie-cutter solutions rarely served the best interests of vulnerable children. As he reviewed the mountains of documentation in Emma's case, social worker reports, medical records, psychological evaluations, and testimony from various professionals, he began to recognize a critical problem that would need to be addressed if this hearing was to be successful. The fundamental issue was this: Emma's testimony was crucial to the proceedings. In custody cases involving young children, the child's statements about their home environment, their relationship with various caregivers, and their sense of safety were considered important evidence. However, Emma was so profoundly traumatized that she could barely function in normal circumstances, let alone in the intimidating environment of a courtroom. She hadn't spoken more than a few words at a time in weeks. When questioned by professionals, she either remained completely silent or gave responses so mumbled and unclear that they were virtually useless as testimony. The trauma had essentially silenced her, locking away whatever insights she might have offered into her own experiences and her feelings about the people in her life. Judge Harrison knew that simply forcing Emma to testify would be traumatizing and ultimately counterproductive. The child's state of mind was so fragile that subjecting her to intense questioning in a formal legal setting might cause permanent psychological damage. Yet without some way to access Emma's voice, without some method of helping her communicate her experiences and feelings, the judge would be left making decisions based solely on adult testimony and documentation. There had to be another way, a more compassionate approach that could somehow help this frightened child find a pathway to communication. The judge reached out to the court's victim advocate, a compassionate professional named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had spent 15 years working with traumatized children in the legal system. Dr. Chen was known throughout the courthouse for her creativity and her deep commitment to finding solutions that served children's emotional needs while still advancing the interests of justice. When Judge Harrison posed the problem to her, how could they help Emma communicate in a way that didn't further traumatize her? Dr. Chen immediately thought of a solution that had been gaining recognition in recent years: animal-assisted therapy in the courtroom. Dr. Chen explained to the judge that numerous research studies had demonstrated the remarkable healing and therapeutic power of specially trained animals, particularly dogs, in helping traumatized children overcome anxiety and access their capacity for communication. Dogs, she noted, don't judge, don't ask complex questions, and don't represent authority or threat. A child who cannot speak to a judge or a lawyer might be able to speak to a dog, or at least in the presence of a dog. The animal creates a safe psychological space, a buffer between the child's terror and the external world. Furthermore, The simple act of petting or interacting with a calm, gentle dog activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the brain responsible for calming and relaxation. A traumatized child's nervous system is constantly in fight-or-flight mode, flooded with stress hormones. A therapy dog could potentially help reset that nervous system, creating a window of opportunity where Emma might be capable of engaging more meaningfully with her surroundings. Judge Harrison was intrigued but cautious. He had never brought an animal into his courtroom before, and he was concerned about setting a precedent or compromising the dignity of the proceedings. However, after Dr. Chen presented him with research studies and examples of successful cases from other jurisdictions, he became convinced that this unconventional approach was justified. The well-being of the child had to supersede traditional courtroom protocol. He authorized Dr. Chen to contact the police department's Victim Assistance Dog Program. The search led them to Officer Max, a 4-year-old German Shepherd who had been specially trained for exactly this kind of work. Max was no ordinary police dog. While he had some basic police training, his primary function was victim assistance and trauma support. He had undergone intensive certification in courthouse behavior, trauma response, and victim support. His training had taken nearly 2 years and had cost tens of thousands of dollars. But the investment had paid off in the form of a remarkable animal who understood his purpose and executed it with almost uncanny sensitivity. Officer Max's handler was a dedicated police officer named Officer James Mitchell, a man in his mid-40s who had worked with Max for 3 years and had developed an almost telepathic understanding of the dog's moods and communications. Officer Mitchell had worked with Max in dozens of courtroom situations, helping traumatized children, adult victims of violent crimes, and witnesses who were struggling with anxiety. He knew exactly how to position Max, how to encourage the dog to interact with frightened individuals, and when to give the dog space to work his quiet magic. The process of arranging Officer Max's appearance in the courtroom required coordination between multiple parties. The defense and prosecution had to agree to the arrangement, which they did readily, both recognizing that Emma's well-being should be the primary concern. The judge issued an order allowing the animal in the courtroom, specifying that Officer Max would be present to provide emotional support to the child witness. Detailed protocols were established regarding where the dog would be positioned, how he would be managed, and what would happen if his presence became disruptive to the proceedings. Officer Mitchell prepared Officer Max specifically for Emma's case, even though Max was already accustomed to courtroom work. Mitchell wanted to ensure that Max's energy and demeanor would be perfectly calibrated to meet the specific needs of this particular traumatized child. The afternoon before the hearing's continuation, Officer Mitchell took Officer Max to the courthouse so the dog could become familiar with the space. They walked through the courtroom, allowing Max to smell the benches, to acclimate to the formal environment, and to prepare himself psychologically for the work that lay ahead. Max moved through the space with calm professionalism, his demeanor indicating that he understood the importance of the task before him. Mitchell had worked with Max long enough to recognize the subtle signs that the dog was ready, that he had entered into his working mindset. As news spread through the courthouse that a therapy dog would be present for Emma's hearing, the staff members and attorneys involved in the case began to understand that they were about to participate in something unusual and potentially transformative. Everyone who had interacted with Emma recognized how desperately the little girl needed help, how much her trauma was interfering with her ability to function. If a dog could provide even a small measure of comfort, even a tiny opening through which Emma might find her voice, then the unconventional measure seemed not just justified but necessary. The stage was being set for a moment that would touch the hearts of everyone present and demonstrate the profound healing power of compassion, connection, and the remarkable bond that can form between a traumatized child and a specially trained animal who asks nothing but to be present. The morning of the hearing's continuation arrived with a sense of anticipatory tension that permeated the courthouse. Staff members whispered about the therapy dog that would be present, some skeptical, others hopeful. Word had spread through the building, and more courthouse personnel than usual found reasons to be nearby when the proceedings resumed. Judge Harrison had made it clear that curiosity seekers would not be tolerated, but the genuine interest in seeing whether this unconventional approach would help the traumatized child was palpable throughout the building. Emma arrived at the courthouse with her grandmother at 9:30 in the morning, her anxiety evident in every fiber of her being. She had barely slept the previous night, her nightmares punctuated by periods of restless wakefulness. Margaret had tried to prepare her granddaughter for what lay ahead, explaining in simple terms that they would return to the big building, that the nice judge would ask some questions, that everything would be okay. But reassurance meant little to a 3-year-old, whose nervous system had been fundamentally altered by trauma. Emma's body knew danger, recognized threat, and responded accordingly, regardless of what her grandmother's words attempted to convey. As they sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin, Emma was even more withdrawn than she had been the previous day. She wore the same pink dress, now wrinkled from being slept in. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and she had developed a habit of humming quietly to herself, a self-soothing behavior that Margaret recognized as a sign of severe distress. Emma's stuffed rabbit was held even more tightly than before, pressed against her small chest, as if it could protect her from the overwhelming world around her. Officer James Mitchell arrived with Officer Max approximately 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to resume. The sight of the large German Shepherd walking through the courthouse hallway caused several people to stop and stare. Officer Max was an impressive animal, muscular, alert, and dignified in his official police vest. However, what distinguished Max from a typical police dog was the quality of his presence. There was something in his demeanor, in the way he moved and carried himself, that communicated intelligence, purpose, and an almost palpable gentleness. His brown eyes seemed to miss nothing, yet they conveyed warmth rather than aggression. Margaret noticed Officer Max approaching and felt a flutter of hope rise in her chest. She had read the information about the therapy dog program, understood the research behind animal-assisted therapy, but seeing the actual animal in person was different from reading about the concept. She gently squeezed Emma's hand, but the little girl didn't look up. Emma was staring at the floor, completely absorbed in her own internal world of anxiety. Officer Mitchell guided Max to the courtroom at precisely 10:00 a.m., the designated time for the proceedings to resume. Judge Harrison was already in his chambers, preparing for the session. The courtroom itself had been arranged slightly differently than the previous day. The bench where Emma would sit had been repositioned to be closer to the judge, but also in a location where Officer Max could be positioned nearby without being disruptive to the formal proceedings. A soft mat had been placed on the floor in an unobtrusive corner, the location where Officer Max would rest while remaining visible and accessible to Emma. When Emma and Margaret entered the courtroom, Emma's anxiety was immediately apparent to everyone present. The child was trembling, her breathing rapid and shallow. She clung to her grandmother as if physical proximity could somehow save her from this frightening situation. But then something extraordinary began to happen. As Officer Max moved into the courtroom, Emma's eyes lifted slightly. At first, she didn't seem to register what she was seeing. Her gaze was unfocused, her mind still wrapped in the fog of anxiety. But then something shifted. Officer Max, guided by Officer Mitchell's subtle direction, moved slowly and deliberately into the courtroom. The dog's movements were unhurried and graceful, each step measured and intentional. Max was an expert at reading human emotion, and he immediately sensed the extreme distress emanating from the small child across the room. The dog's entire demeanor adjusted in response. His ears, which might have been alert in a normal situation, relaxed slightly. His tail, which might have wagged with enthusiastic greeting, remained still. His body language communicated absolute calmness, patience, and a willingness to move at whatever pace the frightened child needed. As Officer Max was guided to his designated spot on the soft mat, Emma's eyes followed the dog's movement. Margaret felt the grip on her hand loosen slightly, not much, but noticeably. The little girl was tracking the dog's presence, her nervous system beginning to register something different in the courtroom environment. The dog represented something that nothing else in this frightening space could offer: an absence of judgment, an absence of threat, a simple presence that asked nothing of her. Judge Harrison watched this interaction with keen attention, recognizing that something important was already happening. The judge had presided over many cases involving traumatized children, but he had never seen an intervention work quite this quickly. Emma was still clearly anxious, still clearly struggling, but there was a subtle shift in her overall energy. The rigid tension in her small shoulders seemed to ease infinitesimally. Her breathing, while still somewhat rapid, was becoming slightly more regular. Officer Mitchell positioned himself unobtrusively near Officer Max, the leash held loosely in his hand. He understood that his role now was to be nearly invisible, to allow the connection between the child and the dog to develop without adult interference. Mitchell had learned through years of working with trauma victims that sometimes the most powerful healing happened when adults stepped back and simply allowed the animal to do what it was trained to do. The attorneys in the courtroom, both the prosecutor advocating for permanent custody with Emma's grandmother and the public defender representing Jessica's interests, recognized the significance of what was unfolding. Even the prosecutor and defense attorney, who were on opposite sides of the case, exchanged a meaningful glance. Both were experienced enough to understand that they were witnessing something remarkable, something that transcended the normal adversarial nature of legal proceedings. This was about a child's well-being, and both professionals were moved by the sight of Emma's anxiety beginning to ease in the presence of the calm, gentle dog. As the minutes passed, Emma's awareness of Officer Max's presence seemed to grow stronger. The dog remained absolutely still on his mat, his breathing deep and regular, his brown eyes occasionally glancing toward the child with an expression of infinite patience. Emma's grandmother whispered encouragement. "Look at the nice doggy, sweetheart. The doggy is here to help you feel better." Emma didn't respond verbally, but her body was responding. The trembling had decreased. The white-knuckle grip on her stuffed rabbit had loosened slightly. Most importantly, Emma was beginning to feel something that had been absent from her experience for far too long, a sense of safety in the presence of another living being. Officer Max seemed to understand, on some level beyond human comprehension, that his job was to create a psychological safe zone for this traumatized child. He did nothing dramatic or attention-seeking. He simply existed, calmly and patiently, in the same space as Emma, silently communicating through his mere presence that the world did not have to be as frightening as it felt. It was the beginning of something transformative, the first steps toward a moment that would change Emma's life and touch the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. As the morning progressed and the formal proceedings began, something remarkable continued to unfold in the courtroom. The judge started by reviewing the evidence presented the previous day, establishing the factual foundation upon which the custody decision would be based. The attorneys made their opening statements, reviewing the documentation of neglect, the medical evaluations showing Emma's developmental delays, and the social worker reports detailing the conditions Emma had endured. It was heavy, painful testimony, the kind that made even experienced legal professionals feel the weight of human suffering and systemic failure. Throughout all of this, Emma remained seated on the bench beside her grandmother, but her demeanor was distinctly different from the previous day. The constant trembling had diminished. The desperate grip on her stuffed rabbit had loosened enough that the toy was no longer being compressed into a distorted shape. Most importantly, Emma's eyes kept drifting toward Officer Max, who lay calmly on his mat in the corner of the courtroom. Each time Emma's gaze found the dog, there was a subtle softening in her expression, a momentary easing of the tension that had characterized her presence since arriving at the courthouse. Margaret noticed these changes with a mother's keen eye for detail. She could feel the difference in her granddaughter's body, the way Emma's breathing had become slightly deeper and more regular, the way her small shoulders were beginning to relax from their perpetually hunched position. Margaret had been reading everything she could find about trauma and healing, and she understood that Emma's nervous system was beginning to shift out of its constant state of hypervigilance. The presence of the calm, non-threatening animal was creating a psychological shift, a tiny opening in the fortress of fear that Emma had built around herself. As the morning progressed toward midday, the courtroom took a brief recess. Judge Harrison, recognizing that everyone needed a break from the heavy emotional weight of the proceedings, called a 30-minute recess. During this time, most of the attorneys and court personnel left the courtroom to make phone calls, review documents, or simply take a few moments of mental respite. However, Margaret remained seated with Emma, and Officer Mitchell stayed with Officer Max, maintaining their quiet presence in the courtroom. During this break, something beautiful and entirely unplanned occurred. Emma, who had been watching Officer Max with increasing interest throughout the morning, suddenly seemed to gather her courage. Margaret felt her granddaughter's hand tug gently on her sleeve. Emma's eyes were fixed on the dog, and there was a question in her gaze, an unspoken inquiry about whether it might be possible to get closer to this calm, gentle creature who had somehow made the scary courthouse feel slightly less terrifying. Margaret looked toward Officer Mitchell, silently asking permission with her eyes. Officer Mitchell, who had been observing Emma's growing interest in Officer Max with quiet satisfaction, nodded encouragement. He understood that a brief, controlled interaction between Emma and the dog during the recess could be tremendously beneficial. The dog had been trained for exactly these kinds of moments, opportunities to provide comfort and connection to traumatized individuals. Officer Mitchell gently guided Officer Max to a position closer to where Emma sat. The dog moved with the same deliberate, measured pace he had maintained throughout the morning, communicating through his physical demeanor that there was nothing to fear, nothing to worry about. Max lay down on the courtroom floor, positioning himself at a height where he was neither looming over the child nor appearing vulnerable. It was a perfect posture of non-threatening presence. Emma's body became absolutely still. Every muscle seemed to freeze as the reality of being close to the large dog suddenly became tangible rather than abstract. The dog was bigger than Emma, with fur and teeth and a power that could easily overwhelm a small child. Yet there was something in Officer Max's brown eyes, something in the relaxed set of his body, that communicated absolute benevolence. Max seemed to understand instinctively that he was in the presence of a deeply frightened child, and he adjusted his entire demeanor accordingly. The dog's breathing remained slow and deep. His eyes, while warm and attentive, didn't stare intensely at Emma, but rather looked at her with a gentle, patient gaze that said, "I'm here. I'm safe. You can trust me." Margaret placed her hand on Emma's back, providing gentle encouragement without pushing. "You can touch the doggy if you want to, sweetheart," she whispered. "The doggy's name is Max. He's very nice. He's here to help you feel better." Margaret's voice was soft and reassuring, but she left the decision entirely to Emma. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the gentle availability of connection if Emma wanted to take that step. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, Emma remained frozen, gathering her courage. Officer Max waited with the patience of an animal who had spent years learning to meet traumatized individuals where they were emotionally, without judgment or impatience. The dog's entire being seemed focused on communicating safety to the frightened child before him. Then, with a movement so small it might have been imperceptible to someone who wasn't watching intently, Emma's right arm began to lift. Her tiny hand, which had been gripping her stuffed rabbit, loosened its hold on the toy and slowly extended outward toward Officer Max. Her arm trembled slightly as it moved, fear and courage warring within her small body. Every eye in the courtroom that remained present, the judge watching from the bench, the court clerk, the social worker, Officer Mitchell, was fixed on this moment, understanding that something profoundly important was unfolding. Emma's small hand, so tiny it seemed almost impossibly fragile, reached toward Officer Max's broad, muscular side. There was a moment of hesitation, a final fraction of a second where Emma seemed to be gathering all her courage. Then her hand made contact with the dog's fur. The sensation seemed to register differently than Emma might have expected. Officer Max's coat was soft and warm, the dog's breathing deep and rhythmic beneath her palm. There was something alive and present and trustworthy about the contact. Officer Max responded with perfect restraint. The dog's tail wagged once, twice, a measured and gentle motion that seemed designed specifically to encourage without overwhelming. The dog didn't try to turn toward Emma, didn't attempt to lick her face or engage in enthusiastic greeting behavior. Instead, Max simply accepted the child's touch with absolute grace, remaining in his calm, reassuring posture. Margaret felt tears begin to stream down her face as she witnessed her traumatized granddaughter make physical contact with another living being voluntarily, for the first time in months. This small gesture, a 3-year-old child reaching out to touch a dog, represented an extraordinary step forward in Emma's healing journey. It signified a willingness to trust, a belief that at least one thing in this scary world was safe and worthy of connection. The moment stretched out, suspended in time, as Emma's small hand continued to rest on Officer Max's side, her trembling gradually subsiding as she felt the warmth and aliveness of the gentle animal beneath her palm. Emma's hand remained on Officer Max's side for several long moments, her trembling gradually subsiding as she absorbed the sensation of touching the dog. The soft warmth of Max's fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the absolute gentleness of his presence, all of it seemed to communicate something that Emma's traumatized nervous system desperately needed to hear. That the world contained things that were safe, that touch didn't always hurt, that connection could be gentle and comforting rather than frightening and painful. Margaret continued to sit beside her granddaughter, her hand resting gently on Emma's back, tears flowing freely down her weathered face. She had prayed for this moment, hoped for some sign that her granddaughter might eventually heal, that the deep wounds inflicted by neglect and trauma might somehow begin to mend. Watching Emma make this voluntary contact with Officer Max felt like witnessing a small miracle, a tiny but significant breakthrough in a child's long journey toward recovery. Officer Mitchell remained absolutely still, understanding the profound importance of this moment. He had witnessed similar interactions before, had seen therapy dogs work their quiet magic with traumatized children, but it never ceased to move him. The connection between a frightened child and a calm, gentle animal was something that transcended ordinary human experience. It was a connection based on pure presence, devoid of the complex layers of judgment, expectation, and emotional baggage that human relationships inevitably carried. As the recess period began to wind down and the judge's chambers signaled that the proceedings would resume in approximately 5 minutes, Margaret gently encouraged Emma to return to her seat. Officer Mitchell guided Officer Max back to his designated spot on the soft mat in the corner of the courtroom. Emma complied with her grandmother's gentle direction, but her eyes remained fixed on the dog as they moved. There was something different in the child's gaze now, not quite peaceful, but less desperately anxious. Emma had touched something safe. She had experienced a moment of genuine connection with a being who asked nothing of her but to simply exist in proximity. The courtroom gradually filled again as the recess ended. The attorneys returned to their seats, the court clerk resumed her position, and Judge Harrison re-entered from his chambers. The formal proceeding resumed with the continuation of testimony regarding Emma's medical and developmental status. A pediatrician testified about Emma's failure to thrive, her low weight percentile for her age, and the developmental delays that were consistent with prolonged neglect and nutritional deficiency. A psychologist presented detailed findings from her evaluation of Emma, describing symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and significant anxiety. The testimony was clinical, factual, and emotionally devastating. Every professional in the courtroom understood the implications of what was being described: a child whose development had been fundamentally compromised by the failure of the adults who should have protected her. Yet throughout all of this heavy, difficult testimony, something remarkable was happening. Emma, who had barely been able to function in the courtroom the previous day, remained relatively calm. She still showed signs of anxiety. Her fingers occasionally played with the edge of her dress. Her leg bounced slightly as she sat. But the overwhelming terror that had characterized her presence seemed to have diminished. Margaret attributed much of this change to the connection Emma had made with Officer Max. The dog's continued presence in the courtroom seemed to have created a psychological anchor for the little girl. Whenever Emma's anxiety began to rise, whenever the weight of the proceedings seemed to be overwhelming her, her eyes would drift toward Officer Max. And each time she made eye contact with the dog, there was a subtle calming effect, a moment where Emma seemed to remember that she wasn't entirely alone in this frightening place. As the afternoon progressed, the attorneys began preparing for the portions of the hearing where they would attempt to elicit information from Emma herself. The judge had been clear that any testimony from the 3-year-old would be conducted gently and carefully, with consideration for her emotional state. The prosecution's attorney, a woman named Sandra Martinez who had been practicing family law for 20 years, approached the matter with deep sensitivity. She understood that her goal wasn't to cross-examine or trap a child, but simply to give Emma an opportunity to express her feelings and experiences in whatever limited way she was capable. Ms. Martinez approached Emma's seat slowly and deliberately, making her movements predictable and non-threatening. She smiled gently at the little girl and asked, in a soft voice, "Hi, Emma. Do you remember me from yesterday? I'm Sandra. I'm here to help make sure you're safe and happy." Emma didn't respond verbally, but her eyes flickered toward Officer Max before returning to Ms. Martinez's face. Ms. Martinez recognized the glance and understood its significance. The dog was Emma's emotional anchor, her source of safety in this intimidating environment. "Emma," Ms. Martinez continued gently, "I want to ask you a few questions. Is that okay?" Emma remained silent, but she nodded slightly, a barely perceptible movement of her small head. Ms. Martinez proceeded with the utmost care, asking simple, age-appropriate questions. "Do you like living with your grandma?" Emma's response was barely audible, a whispered yes that seemed to require enormous effort to produce. "Do you feel safe with your grandma?" Again, a whispered affirmation. The questions continued, carefully calibrated to Emma's ability to respond. But as the questioning went on, Emma's anxiety began to increase again. Her responses became even quieter, her body more tense. Ms. Martinez recognized that they were approaching the limits of what Emma could manage. The attorney glanced toward Officer Mitchell, silently asking whether there was anything that could be done to help the child continue engaging. Officer Mitchell, reading the situation with the expertise gained from years of working with trauma victims, made a subtle hand gesture. Officer Max, understanding his handler's silent direction, rose from his mat and moved slightly closer to Emma's position, not so close as to be disruptive or inappropriate, but close enough that the child could see and sense the dog's presence more immediately. The movement was so subtle that an untrained observer might not have noticed it, but its effect on Emma was immediate and profound. As Officer Max repositioned himself, Emma's eyes locked onto the dog. And in that moment, looking at the calm, gentle face of the animal who had shown her kindness, something broke open inside the traumatized little girl. Her lips trembled slightly, and she opened her mouth as if gathering courage for something monumental. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Emma's voice, when it finally emerged, was small and uncertain, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the courtroom. But in that silent, formal space, every word rang out with crystalline clarity. Emma looked directly at Officer Max and whispered the two words that would echo through the hearts of everyone present. "Good dog." The silence that followed was absolute. Emma's grandmother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ms. Martinez felt her eyes fill with tears. The judge, a man who had heard countless testimonies in his 30 years on the bench, seemed visibly moved. Even the court clerk looked up from her transcription, understanding that something extraordinary had just happened. The simple words, spoken by a 3-year-old girl who had barely spoken coherently in weeks, carried weight far beyond their literal meaning. In those 2 words, Emma had communicated trust, connection, and a capacity for positive emotion that testified to her remarkable resilience despite everything she had endured. The moment Emma spoke those 2 simple words, "Good dog," something shifted fundamentally in the courtroom atmosphere. It was as if a barrier had been breached, as if the traumatized child who had been locked behind walls of fear and pain had found a crack through which her authentic self could begin to emerge. Judge Harrison, who had seen many remarkable moments in his 3 decades on the bench, recognized immediately the profound significance of what had just occurred. This wasn't merely a child acknowledging an animal. This was a deeply wounded child demonstrating her capacity for connection, her ability to recognize and respond to kindness, her willingness to trust in the presence of unconditional acceptance. Margaret pulled her granddaughter close, her body trembling with emotion. She whispered repeatedly into Emma's hair, "Yes, baby. Yes, sweetheart. Very good dog. Very, very good dog." Her words were barely coherent through her tears, but their meaning was crystal clear. She was witnessing her granddaughter breaking through the psychological barriers that trauma had erected. She was seeing Emma, the real Emma beneath the fear and pain, beginning to emerge into the light. Officer Max, demonstrating the extraordinary training that had been invested in him over the course of 2 years, responded to Emma's words with perfect restraint and sensitivity. The dog's tail wagged gently, once, twice, a measured and controlled movement that seemed designed precisely to encourage without overwhelming the fragile child. Max maintained his calm demeanor, his brown eyes reflecting warmth and acceptance, communicating through his entire being that he understood what Emma had just accomplished, and that her gesture of connection was valued and reciprocated. The dog seemed to understand, on some level beyond human comprehension, that his role in this moment was not to demand attention or affection, but simply to remain present and steady, a living embodiment of safety. Ms. Martinez, the prosecution's attorney, paused in her questioning, understanding that continuing with formal interrogation would be inappropriate at this moment. She looked toward Judge Harrison, silently asking for direction. The judge, recognizing that something therapeutically important was occurring, gestured for Ms. Martinez to proceed at whatever pace Emma could manage. The attorney returned her attention to the little girl, her voice even gentler than before. "Emma, that's a very good boy, isn't it?" "Max is a very good dog." Emma didn't respond verbally, but her body language had shifted noticeably. The rigid tension that had characterized her posture throughout both days of the hearing had softened considerably. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up toward her ears, relaxed downward. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened and slowed. "Emma," Ms. Martinez continued carefully, "Max helps make people feel better when they're scared or sad, doesn't he?" Emma's eyes remained fixed on Officer Max, but she gave the tiniest of nods, a movement so subtle that the court reporter almost missed it in her transcription. But everyone else in the courtroom saw it, understood it, recognized in that small gesture the beginning of Emma's re-engagement with the world around her. With Officer Max's continued presence and the subtle encouragement of his calm demeanor, Emma seemed to find resources within herself that had been unavailable to her just minutes before. She continued to answer Ms. Martinez's carefully constructed questions, her responses still quiet and sometimes difficult to hear, but increasingly coherent and substantive. When asked about her grandmother, Emma spoke in single words: nice, loves me, safe. But the very act of producing these words seemed to represent a monumental achievement for the traumatized child. The defense attorney, representing Jessica's interests, also had the opportunity to question Emma. However, recognizing both the ethical implications of pressing a traumatized 3-year-old and the obvious emotional state of the child, the defense attorney kept her questioning to an absolute minimum. She asked only a few brief questions about Emma's relationship with her mother, and when Emma's anxiety began to rise at these inquiries, the attorney gracefully concluded her questioning, understanding that further pursuit would be both counterproductive and cruel. Throughout the remainder of the afternoon hearing, Officer Max's presence continued to serve as an emotional anchor for Emma. Whenever the little girl's anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, whenever the weight of the proceedings seemed to be becoming too much to bear, she could look toward the calm dog in the corner of the courtroom and find reassurance. The dog never demanded attention, never required Emma to perform or respond in any particular way. Max's gift to Emma was simply his presence, steady, reliable, completely non-judgmental, and utterly safe. Margaret observed her granddaughter with a mother's keen eye, noticing the subtle but significant changes that occurred throughout the afternoon. Emma's color improved slightly, the ghostly pallor that had characterized her face during the first day of the hearing replaced by a slightly healthier tone. The anxious fidgeting that had been constant gave way to longer periods of relative stillness. Most importantly, Emma's eyes, which had been dull and unfocused for so long, seemed to gain clarity and presence. The child was still clearly struggling, still visibly anxious, but the overwhelming terror that had seemed to consume her had diminished noticeably. As the afternoon progressed and various professionals continued to testify about Emma's condition and needs, the transformation in the child's demeanor became increasingly apparent to everyone present. The court clerk, who transcribed legal proceedings as part of her daily work, found herself looking up repeatedly from her transcription equipment to observe Emma's interaction with Officer Max. The bailiff, who maintained order in the courtroom, made a mental note that this was one of the most emotionally moving hearings he had witnessed in his 20 years of court service. Even the judge, despite his long experience with difficult cases, seemed deeply affected by the sight of a traumatized child finding her way toward healing through the simple, unconditional acceptance of a specially trained animal. During one particularly poignant moment in the late afternoon, Emma reached her hand out toward Officer Max again, a gesture that was becoming more confident with each repetition. This time, the little girl's hand extended with noticeably less trembling than it had during the recess. Officer Mitchell, reading Emma's intention, gave Officer Max permission to move slightly closer. Emma's small hand made contact with the dog's fur, and she stroked the German Shepherd's side in a gentle, almost reverent motion. As she did so, Emma spoke again, her voice slightly louder and more confident than before. "Good dog. Good dog." Margaret felt fresh tears stream down her face, tears born not of despair but of hope. Her granddaughter was healing before her eyes. The child who had arrived at the courthouse 2 days ago, barely able to function, was finding her way back toward wholeness, one small interaction with a gentle dog at a time. The transformation wasn't complete, wasn't anywhere near complete, but the direction of change was unmistakable. Emma was reconnecting with her capacity for trust, for positive emotion, for genuine connection. As the hearing drew toward conclusion for the day, Judge Harrison took a moment to speak directly to Emma. His voice, which could be stern and authoritative when necessary, became warm and gentle. "Emma, you're a very brave girl. I'm very proud of you, and I think Officer Max is very proud of you too." Emma's eyes flickered toward the judge, then back to Officer Max, her lips curving into something that might have been the beginnings of a smile. A genuine smile that reached her eyes, the first such smile anyone could remember seeing on her face in months. It was small, tentative, fragile, but it represented something precious. a child beginning to believe that the world might contain things worth smiling about. The final day of Emma's custody hearing arrived with a sense of resolution hanging in the air. Everyone present understood that Judge Harrison had gathered sufficient evidence to make his determination regarding Emma's future. The little girl walked into the courtroom with noticeably less anxiety than she had displayed during the previous 2 days. She still held her stuffed rabbit close, still stayed physically near her grandmother, but there was a qualitative difference in her demeanor. The child who had arrived at the courthouse appearing on the verge of complete psychological collapse had been gradually replaced by a small girl who was beginning to find her footing in a world that had so thoroughly failed her. Officer Max was present once again, his calm presence providing the same steady reassurance he had offered throughout the hearing. Emma's eyes sought out the dog immediately upon entering the courtroom, and when she made visual contact with Officer Max, her body visibly relaxed. The connection between the traumatized child and the specially trained animal had deepened over the course of the hearing. Emma no longer flinched or trembled when in the dog's presence. Instead, she seemed to draw strength from the animal's unwavering calm and acceptance. The morning's proceedings were devoted to the arguments and legal conclusions from the attorneys representing both sides of the case. The prosecution's attorney, Ms. Sandra Martinez, presented a compelling summary of the evidence. She detailed the documentation of severe neglect, the medical findings of malnutrition and developmental delay, the psychological evaluations confirming complex trauma, and the testimony of social workers and other professionals who had documented the unsuitable conditions of Emma's previous living situation. But beyond the dry recitation of facts and evidence, Ms. Martinez spoke about Emma herself, about the remarkable courage and resilience a 3-year-old girl had demonstrated in a courtroom that would intimidate most adults, about the capacity for connection and trust that Emma had displayed despite everything that had been done to undermine her ability to believe in the goodness of the world. "Your Honor," Ms. Martinez concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "the evidence is absolutely clear that Emma requires a safe, stable, loving home where her physical and emotional needs will be prioritized. Her grandmother, Margaret Chen, has demonstrated unwavering commitment to Emma's well-being. She has fought tirelessly to protect this child, and she is precisely the person Emma needs to guide her through the difficult healing journey that lies ahead. Emma deserves the opportunity to grow up in an environment where she is safe, valued, and unconditionally loved." The defense attorney, representing Jessica's legal interests, presented her arguments acknowledging the severity of the documented neglect, but arguing that her client had potential for rehabilitation and that family reunification should remain a long-term goal. However, even as she made these arguments, there was a resignation in her voice, a recognition that the evidence was overwhelming, and that her client's addiction and failure to protect her child had created circumstances that made immediate reunification impossible. The defense attorney asked only that the door remain open for potential future reconciliation if Jessica successfully completed treatment and demonstrated sustained recovery from her addiction. Judge Harrison listened carefully to both arguments, his weathered face reflecting the weight of the decision he was about to make. He then turned his attention directly to the courtroom, and his words came slowly and with evident emotion. The judge began by acknowledging the complexity of custody cases, the difficulty of determining what living situation serves a child's best interests when family bonds are involved. He spoke about the heartbreak inherent in cases involving neglect and addiction, about the tragedy of children suffering because of adults' inability to overcome their own demons. However, Judge Harrison continued, his voice becoming firmer, the evidence in this case is unambiguous. Emma Chen has suffered severe, documented neglect. She has been exposed to substances, danger, and circumstances that have caused profound psychological and physical harm. While this court recognizes that her biological mother, Jessica Martinez, may have the capacity to recover from her addiction and become a better parent in the future. That possibility does not alter the current reality. Emma requires immediate, stable, safe placement with a caregiver who can meet her complex emotional and physical needs. The judge paused, turning his gaze directly toward Emma and her grandmother. His expression was warm, but his words carried the weight of judicial authority. "I am awarding full custody of Emma Chen to her maternal grandmother, Margaret Chen, effective immediately. This award is based on clear and convincing evidence that such placement serves the child's best interests. Margaret Chen has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to her granddaughter's well-being, and Emma is clearly bonded to and comfortable with her grandmother's care." Margaret felt her legs nearly give way beneath her. She had intellectually known this outcome was likely, but hearing the judge's formal declaration made it real in a way that abstract probability could not. She pulled Emma close, her entire body trembling with relief and gratitude. Emma, sensing her grandmother's emotional response, looked up at Margaret's face. When she saw the tears of joy streaming down her grandmother's cheeks, Emma seemed to understand, on some level, that something important and good had just happened. Judge Harrison continued his ruling, addressing the more complex aspects of Emma's case. The court finds that supervised visitation with the biological mother, Jessica Martinez, may be considered in the future, contingent upon Ms. Martinez's successful completion of comprehensive substance abuse treatment, demonstrated sustained recovery of at least 2 years, and psychological evaluation confirming her capacity to be a safe and stable presence in her daughter's life. Until such time as these conditions are met, visits will not be permitted. The judge then made an unusual additional recommendation, one that reflected his recognition of the power of the unconventional approach that had helped Emma find her voice during the hearing. Furthermore, this court recommends that Emma be enrolled in a comprehensive therapeutic program that includes animal-assisted therapy as a component of her healing process. The presence and interaction with a therapy animal has demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in helping this traumatized child access her capacity for connection and communication. Continued access to such therapeutic support may be instrumental in Emma's long-term recovery. As the formalities of the ruling were completed and the court clerk began processing the necessary paperwork, something remarkable occurred. Emma, who had been sitting quietly beside her grandmother, suddenly stood up on the wooden bench. Her small frame was silhouetted against the formal backdrop of the courtroom, and her gaze was fixed directly on Officer Max. Before anyone could anticipate what she was about to do, Emma pointed directly at the dog and spoke in a voice that was stronger and clearer than any utterance she had made throughout the entire hearing. "Good dog, Officer Max's good dog." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then it happened, something virtually unprecedented in the formal confines of a judicial proceeding. The courtroom erupted in quiet but unmistakable applause. It wasn't the kind of applause one might hear at a theater or a sporting event, but rather the emotional, genuine acknowledgement of something profound and beautiful that had just occurred. The judge didn't attempt to suppress it. The bailiff didn't call for order. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment of genuine human triumph, a moment when a deeply wounded child had found her way toward healing and hope. Officer Mitchell guided Officer Max closer to the bench where Emma stood, and the dog's handler allowed the little girl to make contact with the animal one final time. Emma placed both of her small hands on Officer Max's head, stroking the dog's ears with a tenderness that broke the heart of everyone watching. She whispered words that only the dog could hear. "Thank you, good dog. Thank you for helping me." As Emma and her grandmother prepared to leave the courthouse, walking toward their new life together, Emma turned back one last time to look at Officer Max. She waved her small hand in a gesture of farewell, and Officer Max's tail wagged in response. A simple, pure moment of connection between a traumatized child and a remarkable animal who had asked nothing of her but had given everything. The story of Emma and Officer Max spread through the courthouse and eventually beyond. It became a powerful testament to the healing power of animals and the resilience of children, even those who had suffered the most profound trauma. Emma's two simple words, "good dog," had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from complex interventions or sophisticated therapeutic techniques, but from the unconditional presence of another being who communicates through acceptance rather than judgment. In the weeks and months that followed, Emma began the difficult work of processing her trauma and rebuilding her ability to trust. With her grandmother's steady love and the therapeutic support recommended by the court, which included regular sessions with a trained therapy dog, Emma gradually blossomed. The withdrawn, terrified child who had entered the courthouse began to transform into a little girl who could smile, who could laugh, who could play. She still carried the marks of her trauma, would likely continue to process the painful experiences of her early childhood for years to come, but she had been given the most precious gift, a second chance, a safe place to heal, and the knowledge that love, whether from her grandmother or from a remarkable police dog, was real and worth opening her heart to receive. Officer Max continued his important work, helping other traumatized children find their voices and access their capacity for hope. But for Emma, Officer Max would always occupy a special place in her heart and her memory. The good dog who had shown her that the world contained kindness, that connection was possible, that healing was within reach. And her grandmother, Margaret, would forever be grateful for the extraordinary animal and his dedicated handler who had helped her granddaughter find her way back to life, one gentle moment at a time.